Obviously, in a lot of seminaries and Bible schools, a lot of white preachers and a lot of white theologians are talked about, right? Who are some African American black preachers throughout the centuries, throughout church history, even in recent years, the people who aren't hip or aren't aware of need to be aware of?
Sure. No, man, I appreciate that question. I could say one who's had a direct influence on me. Some of the great preachers of my lifetime. So I'm giving you about 40 years. E.K. Bailey has been a great influence in African American circles to promote expository preaching. There is still a conference annually named after him that is encouraging and promoting faithful Bible preaching and teaching. Dr. A. Lewis Patterson, who served for over 40 years the Mount Corinth Church in Houston. I think Dr. Gardner C. Taylor, who is considered the poet laureate of the American pulpit. And you can find at this point audio recordings of his messages and books with his messages, which I think are important to learn from and study. I think he is a central figure in the civil rights movement, and yet he, as a central figure in the civil rights movement, was also a preacher who transcended culture and race, and was able to speak to the body of Christ in a larger way while he was entrenched in serving the people that he was uniquely called to. I think is a great example to be studying. The very long ministry of a C.A.W. Clark in Dallas, Texas. Those would be good places to start. Manuel Scott Jr. was a excellent preacher who I'm mentioning him again because he was a preacher who preached in both circles. I mean, and these are during days where those color lines were not often crossed. But he is a cherished African American preacher who is just as beloved in African American circles and in white circles. I would also mention S.M. Lockridge. I have heard white pastors who would say one of the best messages they have ever heard were preached by S.M. Lockridge, and you can go on YouTube and catch his "That's My King" message, portions of it. But from what I understand, that was just representative of his consistent, regular preaching, which is just high level preaching. Those would be good places to start. Yeah. And unfortunately, a young man in the session that I taught this morning, because I emphasize that preachers write manuscripts. I think you should write for clarity, even though my intention is not to use it. I want to have a level of freedom, but he's like, I just don't like writing. But as a young African American brother, I told him I absolutely get how you feel, but I tried to encourage him to practice at his writing because we do need more African American writers and voices. I think the reason why white scholars, white preachers, white professors are more discussed is because there is a record of their thought, a record of their ministries, a record of their theologies, a record of their teaching and preaching in books. And unfortunately, we talk about, and maybe in more black circles, we talk about, have you heard E.K. Bailey? And we talk about, have you read in white circles? And I think I just hope the younger generation, especially those who are going through formal training, preparing themselves, would just also consider extending their teaching ministry to writing so that there is a record of African American theology that becomes more of a part of the conversation, which I think would be important.